Hi, Angela Wolf here, owner of Angela Wolf Patterns and Online Sewing Academy. And we are remote on location at my studio again with the travel restrictions, so welcome. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to take a regular top that you own already or a pattern and add lace inserts to do some refashioning. So let's get started. The first thing I want to show you is how to set up for embroidery. I embroidered my own lace, but you could purchase it as well. But if you're going to embroider your own, I'm going to use a smaller hoop to help you through this so you can understand how to lay this out. So for an insert, for example, for a sleeve, you would need to make sure that your lace is going to be wide enough to fit the sleeve. That's the first thing. So even if you have a smaller hoop, maybe you're going to need to do multiple hoopings for this, you want to make sure that you cut your tulle fabric and your stabilizer the width that you need for your designs. So I'm using Sew and Wash Stabilizer. It washes away, it feels like fabric. This is not the sticky back that I used in a different episode. And this is tulle fabric, very soft, lightweight. I'm using it for garments. So there are different variations of tulle. Make sure you touch it and it's not stiff, like a party one that you put in party bags. All right, so here's this. And to hoop this, I would start at whatever end, whatever you're doing. I mean, it depends how big of a project you're doing, but I would start at one end. I hoop both of these together. Loosen up the hoop a little bit. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that the tulle is nice and tight and the stabilizer is nice and tight. It's actually much easier with a smaller hoop than a larger hoop. Because if you pull too hard with this tulle, I'll just show you what will happen. Pull like this. If that's too tight, what happens is you end up with, it ruins the fabric. You can end up with rips or some of this, it's like almost like a netting, and the netting looks really bad. So just be very careful, very gingerly, and just feel around and make sure that everything's laid nice and flat. So you're ready to embroider. All right, so that's the embroidery. So here you would have to imagine I would embroider this piece and then re-hoop and embroider this piece and on and on. So if you have a larger hoop, you can get finished a lot faster. All right, let's move that out of the way. And so here is my lace design. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you have a nice flat edge that you're going to insert. You need a seam allowance, so don't trim too close to this, to your designs. These are serrated scissors, which just cuts right through this so nicely. You could also use a rotary cutter on this. And then on this side, I'm going to leave just a little bit more room. So by using this line here, I'm going to give myself maybe 1.5 inches on this side. I think that fabric needs a little pressing, huh? Okay, so this is what I have to insert. Well, depending if you're going to use a pattern or you're doing this on ready-to-wear, the process is going to be pretty similar. So the first thing you need to do is measure. If you were to stitch right along the edge here, so let's say we're going to stitch right close to the end here, and my next stitch line was way up here. That's 5.5 inches. So that's 5.5 inches, say, that I could insert somewhere, so I have to take 5.5 inches out. All right, so if you do the math on that, I'm just going to use this pattern as an example. We've got 5.5 inches. Let's just say we're going to do an insert similar to the top behind me, the peach top. Down here, I would draw a line where I want the insert to go. So 5.5 inches, you divide that by 2. Two and 3/4 and 2 3/4. Nothing like making it difficult. I should have just made it 5 inches. Wouldn't that been better? All right, so that's what we need to subtract on each side. So 2 3/4. And I'm going to put a dotted line here, or a dashed line, because we have to have seam allowances that I have not talked about yet. So 1, 2 3/4. okay? So this should fit in here. That looks just perfect, right? Now you need seam allowances. So we already have a seam allowance added to here. So I have about looks like a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this end and a little less than that on this end. I kind of cut that a little shy. So I just know that this side I'm only going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this end I'll have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you need to add that back to your pattern. So now this is going to be your cut line. And I always just label my patterns so I know exactly what I have later. Maybe I save this pattern for another time. And then here you're going to do the same thing. So here we're only going to add a 1/4 inch because we didn't have very much room. Seam allowance, and this one is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this is going to be my cut line, and this is going to be my cut line for my pattern. So that's if you're sewing from scratch. Now what about if you have a top laying around already, which I just happen to have one of those. So here's a top that I was doing, I've been like decorating, kind of like an ugly sweater type thing. But I can never make up my mind what I want to do, and then I saw this lace and I thought this could be a lot of fun. So I actually cut the top open. These knit tops don't have a very large seam allowance. I mean, that's barely, gosh, maybe 1/8 inch. So by cutting that, I don't really need to rip all the stitches. I just cut right along the seam. So determine on your sleeve where you want the insert. So let's just say we're going to add something large like this in here, okay? Now, it depends, you know, I'm obviously going to have to cut some of this off, but you can just lay out your design, figure where you want it to go. And that looks like that's about the center. So I'm going to just slide this up. And this is tailor's chalk. There's different kinds of tailor's chalk. This is one that will press off, or there's one here that brushes off. I don't know which one you'll see better, but we'll just try both. So this is where we're going to insert this lace. Again, we're going to do the exact same process. So we had 2 3/4 on each end, right? Actually, I'll just use, I think you'll see better with this here now that we're on a garment. 2 3/4, 2 3/4. And then on this side, remember, we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that's going to be our cut line. Does that make sense? And then on this side, we have a 1/4 inch. That's going to be our cut line. So again, just grab your quilter's ruler. Try to make the lines as even as possible. I love these because you can see through, but this shirt has some sparkles in it, so it's a little tricky to see. I'm using this line here as a guide to make this straight across. All right, there we go. So if I were to cut now, assuming we did our math right, this should fit in here very nicely. So now decide what part of the design is going to go where. So I obviously have more here than I need. So why don't I'm just going to line up this center one. This fold kind of represents the outside of the sleeve. So why don't we go there? So this piece you're going to fold over. Just put a couple pins there. So this side I'll have to be a little careful on how I sew because I don't have a lot of room there. And you'll want to run this through a serger probably, but if you don't have one, you can just run it through the sewing machine, which is what we're going to do here. So that's one side that we're going to sew. And then this side, I might as well just pin all of this at one time. This side is the one with a larger seam allowance. About a 1/2 inch to be exact. And you can see it on here. So make sure, even if I cut that a little crooked, just make sure it's even on your top. Okay, so I'm going to reach my hand under here so you can see. There's the lace, there's the top. let's go sew this. All right, I'm using my pink thread just so you can see it. Now, if you're going to run this through a serger, one thing that you could do is you could just do a basting stitch, and that will just hold this in place, and then run it through a serger. And you know what? That's what I'm going to do. So my stitch is going to be a stitch length of 5.0. This is also a good way to just test the fit to make sure your math was right, right on, I should say. Because if it's not, the sleeve's going to be too short or too long, one or the other. Okay, so here's one. See the lace? And now let's do the other side. I'll flip this around so I can sew it with the lace. It's easier if you sew it with the lace side up, just by the way. Now this one, I have a very small seam allowance. It's just going to barely be touching the tips of that. All right, that looks great. So let's take a closer look here. And I'm just going to bring out my pressing mat. So here is the lace insert. I would run this through the serger now, making sure that it looks okay. And then press the seam allowances toward the garment side so it doesn't pop out of the lace. And then from the right side, I could go back and top stitch that if I wanted to. And that's how simple it is to make a lace insert into a garment that you already own or a pattern that you're working on.